Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the top books that I read in 2020. This list was hard. I've currently read 158 books this year and the year's not even over. So perhaps this is premature, but I figure this list will largely stay consistent even as I finish out December. As many of you also probably noticed this year in your reading, this was the year of reading digitally. So most of the books that I'm going to discuss today, I don't actually have a physical copy of the book. I borrowed it from my library via the Libby app, and I will show them digitally, but I won't have as many of them physically to present in this video. Another thing to keep in mind is that this year I really tried to dip into fictional work and fictional books. And I did manage to do that, but I noticed that my favorite books still tended to be dominated by nonfiction work. So if you like nonfiction, hopefully there will be some interesting books for you in here. If you primarily read fiction, I'll have a couple fictional reads as well, but far fewer than the number of nonfiction books. Okay, let's get to it. The first book on my list for nonfiction is the book Boundaries by Henry Cloud. So this book is a classic, and I'm sure many of you have heard of it before. I had heard about it for many years, but I had kind of put off reading it. I don't know why. Maybe I thought the premise sounded kind of hokey, or maybe sounded like common sense. As someone who grew up bullied and kind of faced a lot of trials and tribulations as a child, I didn't really think I needed to read this book because I feel like, in general, I'm good at setting boundaries. And mainly, I think what I thought of as boundaries was kind of the obvious situations. And I think the way this book really helped me is talking about how to set boundaries in areas that aren't so obvious. You know, how do you set boundaries with those that you care about, where you feel like you're trying to compromise, you're trying to be fair, but you need to set boundaries, even in romantic relationships or with your family or with your job. And I really like this book more than I thought I was going to. I've heard some criticism by some of my close friends who felt that the book was a little too religious for their tastes. So I will warn you that Henry Cloud is a predominantly Christian author, and most of his books center around Christianity and the Bible. So there are a lot of Christian references, which may not be for you. And I personally appreciated the Christian references because when I think back to the last relationship that I had, that relationship was rooted in Christianity. And I felt like that person almost used that as a crutch as to why I shouldn't have boundaries. You know, I'm supposed to be subservient to the man and, be a godly woman who always lets her man lead, So I actually appreciated that this book included Christianity, but still was focused on how we can set boundaries and how we need to set boundaries in life. The next book is Me and White Supremacy by Layla F. Saad. And I read this book after reading probably a dozen other books on race this year. So I think I went into it thinking, okay, what do you got for me? I mean, our journeys are never over when it comes to preventing white supremacy in ourselves and pushing against racial bias. But I really started to think, at what point am I going to read something entirely redundant because I'm reading all these books? But I was pleasantly surprised that Me and White Supremacy still felt important. It felt fresh, and it stood out amongst many of the peers of the other books that I read this year, mainly because I felt like it was just the book I needed to read. I consider myself as someone who wants to be an ally in the Black community, wants to be an ally for people of color, and I don't consider myself racist. I feel pretty affirmed that I'm not blatantly racist or, I understand the Black Lives Matter movement, all these things. So then it can be easy to think that, the issue is with other people and the issue is with people who don't understand these things or have blatant prejudice and bias. And what Layla calls out is that really the people who think they don't have a problem or think that they're not racist can sometimes cause the most harm because you're not even looking for it in your own behavior. And additionally, we are often in a position to push change. And I think that we often don't. We get complacent. We think because we're not causing harm, then therefore we're doing good. And just because you're maybe not causing harm doesn't mean you're necessarily promoting good, I will say this book is very much like a workbook. It's intended to be read like a daily exercise. You don't have to read it that way. You can read it in one sitting. You could read it in 1 week. But it does require a lot of work on your part. It's not a passive read. Most of the days include writing prompts where you are journaling to yourself and answering reflective questions. And I truly think you get the most out of it if you sit down and you take the time to process those reflective questions. The next book on my list is Untamed by Glennon Doyle. So Glennon Doyle started out with having a #1 bestseller book centered around marriage and Christianity when she was married to her husband. And funny enough, I had that book on my to-read list, but I'd never gotten around to it. And then I saw this book coming up over and over again on my Instagram and different places, and I decided to give it a read. And I have to say that it absolutely blew me away. And that might sound cheap. I'm starting to wonder how many times I'm going to say that in this video. But as someone who's consumed a lot of self-help, I was really surprised at how fresh this book felt and how nothing felt regurgitated. It's part memoir where Glennon is sharing her own experience, and I think that helped it not feel stale or feel like a fortune cookie. Sometimes self-help books very much read like a fortune cookie, or it's the exact same things you've read 100 times in different books before. So I really enjoyed the book, and especially for women, if you're a woman or if you identify as female, or if you have a female family member, female friend that you think might love this book. I mean, it's just an absolute incredible read. Next, we have Trust by Pete Buttigieg. So I started out the year by reading The Shortest Way Home, also by Pete Buttigieg, and I really enjoyed that book. I learned so much about his life story, things that I never knew about him, despite the fact that he was at one time my first choice for the presidential nominee. I learned so much about his life that I never knew before. So I knew I had to read Trust when it came out. And the reason I'm putting this one on the list, maybe more so than his other book earlier this year, is this book was partly written this year. You can tell the way it reads and what Pete talks about, that he definitely finished it this year. It's very topical. It's very relevant. And I think he gets to the heart of the matter with the big issue in America, how we are losing our trust. And he really outlines why trust is critical. I mean, that might sound like common sense, but he talks about all the ways that we take it for granted. If you truly didn't trust society or our system, you wouldn't be able to drive your car because you wouldn't trust that our traffic lights were usually operating correctly. You wouldn't be able to eat out. You wouldn't trust the restaurant at all to handle your food, like a true distrust where you could be harmed. You probably wouldn't be able to work because you wouldn't trust that anyone would actually pay you a paycheck after. Trust is truly crucial, and I think that as a society, we kind of take it for granted. I think it's good to be skeptical. It's good to do research. It's good to check your sources. But when we enter a realm where we've decided to trust nothing, I think we enter a pretty dangerous place because it's literally the lubricant for society to operate. So I felt like Pete Buttigieg, although Trust is a very small book, it packs an incredible punch, and it really offers a lot of food for thought. And it also boosted my spirits. It gave me a little bit of hope amidst a year where I feel like I spent so long listening to vitriol and just garbage coming out of the mouths of many people in our government, it was cleansing to read something that made sense and was grounded in reality. Let's say that. The next book on the list is The Rise of the Warrior Cop by Radley Balko. So this book came out in 2013. It didn't come out this year. It's not in a response to 2020. It's not in a response to Trump's America. It's not in a response to, immediately in a response to the Black Lives Matter movement. This book came out before a lot of that took ground and is truly a comprehensive look at the history of police and the history of law enforcement. And as somebody who, my grandfather on my dad's side was a state trooper for the state of Wisconsin. So for some reason, police have held kind of a soft spot in my heart, more so than just the general public of who you can appreciate for protecting the city. But at the same time, Black Lives Matter really brought about a lot of conflicting emotions and really forces us to take a good look at how society has functioned and does it make sense to use police in the way that we use them today? Does it make sense to have them, responding to stray dog calls or responding to mental health crises when they're not maybe the best person for that task? So I had those questions rolling in my mind. And then I came across this book, and it was so comprehensive. It felt very balanced. I mean, I will say it felt like it had a bit of a libertarian slant almost. But I'd say libertarian over Democratic or Republican. But very interesting read, very eye-opening, and very informative. And so highly recommend if the topic interests you whatsoever. The next book on my list is Permanent Record by Edward Snowden. So I had seen the movie based on Edward Snowden. I had also watched numerous documentaries and docu-specials or series about Edward Snowden, and I really felt like I knew everything there was to know about what happened. So I was still interested in the book, but I didn't know if I was really going to get anything new out of it or if it'd be boring. But the book was incredible. It was very phenomenally done. I happened to listen to this one as an audiobook, which I felt was valuable because Edward Snowden narrates the story himself. And I personally like to read memoirs and autobiographies when the author records their own audiobook, because you can hear the story literally come to life straight from their own mouth and their own voice. So I definitely enjoyed the book. I don't know if it radically changed my perspective on Edward Snowden, because I was kind of neutral on, I could see sort of both sides of how he had done a good thing, how he'd done a bad thing. But I definitely think it helped explain some of his motives and his behaviors for somebody who might look at it from a third person and not really understand why he would have done it or why he would have handled it the way he did. This book will definitely help you gain that perspective. The next book on my list was The Skin We're In by Desmond Cole. So this was a book I read early on in the year, even before George Floyd was killed. I had read this book. It's about police brutality and police bias in Canada. And at first, I was kind of surprised to read it, because I think if you grew up in the U.S. and you're American, you tend to think that the police issue and race issue is maybe an American issue. I think it's easy to feel that way. And to give you some background, so I completed a grad school program last year in December, and our capstone, even though it was a business program, our capstone was to partner with a police force in Canada. And knowing what I know from that project and how we went into that project, keenly interested in digging into the police data and what we were going to find, also very much aware that we didn't want to create a weapon of mass destruction, as Kathy O'Neill has coined the term. But we also felt like we had a lot of baggage. Like, we don't want to bring our American police baggage into this assignment just because we're from the US and we're aware of the climate, And so I remember having certain questions like why they didn't include race in the data they gave us, but not really wanting to bring it up because you don't want to make your professor look bad. This is for school. We're not getting paid. Again, you're fearful that you're bringing in like American baggage. So we just didn't really address it. And so by the time I got to this book and I was reading about how much of a problem there is with police and racial tension in Canada, it made me kind of angry that I didn't have this context going into the project. Despite the fact that I tried to Google news articles, I tried to get a lay of the land before we went into the project, but it didn't really come to fruition the same way of reading what this book opened my eyes to. And I will say that if I had read this book before I did that project, I probably would have declined to do that project, which I didn't even know was an option until we found out partway through that one group was working with the NFL. And I'm like, hey, what? Like, I didn't know that was a choice. But anyway, this book truly opened my eyes, and it makes you realize that this isn't just a U.S. issue. It's not just an American issue. It's an issue on a global scale, and it's happening in more than just our country. And I think it was a worthwhile read. The next book, The War on Normal People by Andrew Yang. So I will admit that I kind of slept on Andrew Yang. He was not my guy in any point of the primary process. I wasn't anti-Andrew Yang. He just didn't speak to me. He didn't call to me. But The War on Normal People is really a book about automation and how automation is going to revolutionize the American workforce. In many ways, that's a good thing. We shouldn't totally fear automation because there might be an area where you can make a job safer if a robot can do it. You could make it more effective or less error prone somehow. So it's really not an attack on technology, an attack on progression, but just a real honest look of the reality of what is this going to look like for many people? Which jobs are going to be impacted first? And the first half of the book reads like, this is why we're all effed, or this is why we're all fucked, pardon my French. The second part of the book, second half, is really like, okay, what are we going to do about it? And whether you agree with Yang's solutions or not, you have to appreciate a book that's going to lay out issues, but then also lay out suggestions and not just leave you hanging with, well, what do we do about that? He actually talks about some real tangible solutions on how we can combat some of the things that he predicts will happen in the first half of the book. Powerful read, very informative. I think it's a wake-up call. I think in the past few years in America, we've been told that, China is stealing our jobs or illegal immigrants are stealing our jobs. And pushing all of that aside, which you could comment on for numerous reasons, the reality is automation is coming for your job. Automation is coming for more jobs and coming more quickly than international competition or illegal immigrants. So for anyone who is concerned about illegal immigrants taking their job, if that's a real fear you have, if you really truly fear China taking your job, you should be paying attention to automation because it's happening, it's coming, it's here for many people, but it's going to come in a much bigger way. And I think it's important too that Andrew Yang really talks about why this is different than every other stage of, like the Industrial Revolution and different things. He talks about why this is different, why this is not the same, why it's not just going to be adaptable in the ways that we've always adapted. So highly recommend, very informative. I enjoyed it. The next book is called Mindfuck, although there's an asterisk over the U, but Mindfuck by Christopher Wiley. So this is about the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and I'm sure many of you have probably heard by now what that was, or you're familiar with the name Cambridge Analytica. You may have even watched the documentary The Great Hack, and I watched The Great Hack myself on Netflix. So I went into this book really not sure, like, how much am I going to learn from this? Like, is this going to tell me anything new? But I was also curious because while Christopher Wiley is in The Great Hack, he really is only in for a few minutes. They don't interview him very much. So I think I went into it thinking, okay, here you have this like peripheral character who got his 15 seconds of fame in a documentary. Now he's going to write a book about it. But the book really blew me away. And he really was more central than the documentary would lead me to believe. And he really he wrote this very well. You know, sometimes people that are real people are not professional writers. You don't really know what you're going to get with a book. But Christopher Wiley's book is very well written and very informative. If you're curious about Cambridge Analytica or just internet privacy in general, I highly recommend reading Mindfuck. The next on the list is White Negroes by Lauren Michelle Jackson. So why I chose this book, again, I read a lot of books on race, and honestly, almost all of them were truly amazing. I mean, I think I gave at least 4 stars to almost every one of them. But with White Negroes, what this book really helped me wrap my head around was cultural appropriation. I feel like in my journey of learning more and trying to become more aware of racial differences and the ways that I cause harm, or do things unintentionally, cultural appropriation was something I really couldn't confidently say that I knew exactly what it was. You know, like before I read the book, it was, is listening to rap music cultural appropriation? You don't really know. Some of the questions you might have yourself might sound totally ignorant, but you just don't know. And what I enjoyed about this book is Lauren really lays it out, and she talks truly on an expert level about cultural appropriation, everything from Eminem to the Kardashians and in between. And I really, really appreciated her perspective and really helped me understand what is and what isn't cultural appropriation. After that, the next book I have on my list is Good Morning, Destroyer of Men's Souls by Nina Renata Aaron. So this book is kind of funny. Sometimes when I read books, in some cases, I kind of go in blind a little bit. I mean, not to say that I judge it by its cover, but I don't want to be spoiled by a book. I feel like sometimes you read the synopsis and you learn too much and the book isn't very good anymore. And so I'm pretty sure I saw this book, like a Goodreads friend had read it and it had a good average rating. So I thought, you know what, I'll read it. And I'm also embarrassed to say that I think I went into it thinking it was fiction. Because again, I didn't do research because I was trying to avoid spoilers or knowing too much. And this is actually nonfiction. It's a memoir. And Nina, what she talks about is growing up with an alcoholic father and having a family that very much battled addiction, and watching her mom kind of bear most of that front, and what it's like when the codependency of addiction in relationships, because Nina goes on to get into a serious longer-term relationship with a guy who's also an addict. And so she runs parallels between, when she goes to AA and she learns about kind of the structure of addiction within relationships, she starts to draw connections between what her mom went through and what she's going through now. And I really enjoyed it more than I thought I would. I know addiction impacts almost everybody in some way, if not yourself, someone you know. I fortunately don't really have anyone in my immediate family circle that has struggled with addiction in this way. So I almost thought, once I figured out what it was about and where it was going, I almost thought maybe this isn't the book for me. But it was such a gripping memoir, and so gripping in the way that she told her story, that it was one of the best books I read this year, and I highly recommend. Next on the list is the book Felon by Reginald Dwayne Betts. This is actually a collection of poems, and I read a lot of poetry this year. I'm trying to get into poetry. I'm struggling with poetry because my brain just doesn't work that way. And so, sometimes I really do not understand the poetry, but I make an attempt. But this book, Felon, most of the poems, I felt like I truly understood what was being said, but it was so powerful. It's about what it means to be Black in America, but also being a Black male and being a Black male who's been incarcerated, and really what it feels like almost to have that target on your back like your entire life. So I very much enjoyed this collection of poems in the sense that it was powerful. I mean, I wouldn't say, it's obviously not a beach read, so enjoyed is maybe the wrong word, but it was powerful and it touched me. So I highly recommend. Next is the book, The Education of an Idealist by Samantha Power. And this book I absolutely loved and adored and devoured. And I will give you some personal background as to why I enjoyed it. And maybe that might mean that I enjoyed it more than the average person would enjoy it. But The Education of an Idealist is about Samantha Power and her journey to becoming the ambassador to the UN under Obama. And I'm not holding my breath on this dream, but at one time I had a dream to work for the State Department and be an ambassador, take the FSOT and get out there. And with every passing day, that becomes more and more less likely. But therefore, I was automatically interested in this story and reading about Samantha Power. I will say that I read a few other books this year by other women that have held this title, and this was the best book of all of them. So I will say that even though they were all kind of similar and each one of them mentions the other, I really enjoyed Samantha's probably the most, and it was one of the best books that I read this year. The next on the list is A Very Punchable Face by Colin Jost, and this is a book that I do have a copy of. Where I don't have many copies of all the books, I have a copy of this book. So, Colin Jost, for those of you who watch SNL, he does the Weekend Update, and I didn't realize before reading this book just how long he has been at SNL. He's been at SNL since 2005. I could be wrong, 2004, I think 2005. Basically since when I began high school, and that just blows my mind because I don't think I was very aware of him before he got out of his little writing nook and made his first appearance on the Weekend Update. But really fascinating. I don't want to spoil anything, but it's written to be funny. I actually laughed out loud, and I know that I don't always laugh out loud on books that are trying to be funny. Sometimes they're not as funny as they're attempting to be, and this book was truly funny, truly laugh out loud. And Colin himself went to Harvard, and I had always wondered, how do you go from Harvard to being a writer for SNL? And he answers that for us in this book. So if you read it, you too will discover how he went from Harvard to SNL and many other things. He talks about growing up in Staten Island. He talks about his mom, and the chapter alone on his mom made me sob and was truly touching. So highly recommend reading A Very Punchable Face by Colin Jost. Great read. Knocking stuff over. So the next book on the list for us to talk about, another book that I have a copy of. This is Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. And this is actually the first Margaret Atwood that I have read. I've seen The Handmaid's Tale, like a lot of people, but I never actually read the book The Handmaid's Tale. So this was my first time reading one of her books, getting into her writing style, and I absolutely loved it. This particular book is about a pandemic and a plague, and for some people, that might not be the book they want to read right now, but it's definitely more of a science fiction twist, more technology-based, and also just, again, her writing. There's humor sprinkled throughout here that I thought was so funny, where it's definitely not for children, but it was the right amount, the perfect amount to remind you you're an adult reading adult books and adult things, but not so much that it felt cheesy, overdone, or poorly timed or unnecessary. She really, really balanced that out. but couldn't put it down. Absolutely enjoyed it. And it's actually part of a trilogy, the Mad Adam trilogy. And so I'm waiting on the second and third copy, and I will continue my way through it. Okay. Good deal. Next on our list is another book that I own. We're really getting on the books that I actually owned. So, Ducks Newburyport. And yes, this thing is a monster. This thing is huge, gigantic, intimidating. I had seen this come up a couple times with booktubers, and because of its size and because of really having no idea what, the title doesn't tell you much. Is this a mystery? Is this a historical fiction? Really doesn't tell you a lot. And so I kind of avoided it just because it was intimidating me. But finally, I saw a review by Kamil, and I will link his YouTube review of this below because it was absolutely phenomenal. I mean, he does this book justice, maybe the only way you can, just because it's such a thick book. But this book is one entire stream of consciousness from an Ohio housewife. So the 1,040 pages is a single sentence. No breaks. I mean, there's commas, but no periods, no paragraph breaks, no chapters, nothing. It's just a continuous stream. And that might sound like a nightmare, but I felt like once you get kind of 15 to 20% into the book, which is quite a ways, because again, it's a long book, so you have to get past, 200 and 250, you start to see a pattern, and you start to pick up on a narrative of sorts, a storyline. It has direction. It is going somewhere. It has a conclusion. The conclusion makes sense. And I really can't sum it up any better than Kamil does in his review. So I will just link his video below and you can watch his review because it was absolutely phenomenal. And if he doesn't get you fired up to read this book, I don't know who will. So I will definitely link that below. Okay. Next on our list is a book called Tell Me How It Ends. And this book is written by Valeria Luiselli, could be wrong. So this woman is an immigrant to the United States, and she is a native Spanish-speaking immigrant. And while in the U.S., at one point, she ends up having to renew her work visa and finds herself in a project working with children who have come over the border from Mexico and are being held or detained and going through the legal process of whether or not they will be granted entrance into the U.S. or if they'll have to be sent back and start their journey over again. And this book is very short, so if you're not much of a reader, I wouldn't be intimidated. It's a short volume. But she basically writes a book about the survey questions, the 40 questions that the legal team she was part of and that most of the team interacting with these children, what they have to ask these children to vet them and decide whether they get to stay or not. And it's really a chilling book in many ways to hear about the harrowing circumstances. It answered a lot of questions that I had as to how you end up with children crossing the border alone, or how you end up with so many children in need of the Dreamers Act or DACA. I didn't fully understand how we got a system that worked that way and why we had kind of that, the bottleneck, so to speak, in the system that's leading to so many children kind of being stuck and detained at the border. So the book, like I said, is 40 questions that she's basically having to ask these children to determine their fate. Not an enviable job. I mean, for as much as any of us would wish we could be down there doing something to help and make a difference, that sounds like an absolutely harrowing and heavy job. Next on our list, and we're almost done, people. We are almost there. Hallelujah. The next on the list is Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. So Elizabeth Gilbert is the author of Eat, Pray, Love, and I haven't read Eat, Pray, Love, so I have no opinion on that book. But I had seen a couple friends read this book this year, and I was like, maybe there's something to this. Again, I get a little leery now of self-help. Like I feel like I've read everything and it's no longer going to be profound. But I'm really glad I picked up this book. And to summarize the book, it's basically like one big pep talk to push you to go for whatever you're afraid to go for. If you want to write a book, but you're afraid to start because you think it's going to be crappy, or you want to produce a song and get it out on Spotify, but you're afraid it's going to suck, she really empowers the reader to not be afraid and just go for it and just finally rip off that Band-Aid. And so I thought it was phenomenal. I definitely enjoyed it more than I thought I would. Just based on the book itself, reading the description, looking at the cover, reading what it's supposed to be about. These books tend to be like a 3 for me most times, because even if I get some nuggets out of it, I would say usually at least half of it ends up being just cliche or overly done, already stated. But this one was a 5 out of 5 for me. So highly recommend if you need some inspiration. Big Magic is the book for you. And then the last book that I actually physically have from my list, and second to last book on the list, is Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. And this book is about the Troubles that took place in Northern Ireland from the 1960s to the mid-1990s. And I went into this book like embarrassingly ignorant of the Troubles. My dad comes from an Irish Catholic family, and I am like a quarter British Irish, according to 23andMe. Doesn't really break it out by British or Irish. It just says British Irish. But I knew very little about the Troubles. Definitely it completed when I was in elementary school in the 90s, but I don't remember a lot of the news from back then. And I don't remember hearing much about it in history class or going over it in school. But this book in particular had been on my list because not only was it the New York Times, one of the 10 best books of 2019, but Barack Obama said it was one of the best books he read in 2019. And when I finally was going to get around to reading it, and you could see I have quite a few tabs on there, definitely informative. I finally got around to reading it. I asked my dad if he wanted to read it with me because he's more of a nonfiction person and generally more of a true crime person. And I wouldn't say this is like a crime book, but obviously it's horrific atrocities, and it centers around a mother who disappeared during the Troubles. And so me and my dad read it together. So if you haven't done a father-daughter read or a mother-son or a mom and daughter read, highly recommend to book club with your parents. It was very informative. And now I've been watching Dairy Girls on Netflix, and I have a couple fictional books that take place during the Troubles as well. And last but not least, and this book, originally I didn't have this book on the list, but I had 19 top books of 2020, and 19 just felt like a weird number, like it needed to be round. 20 books in 2020. Let's just stick with the 20s. So the last book was Outspoken by Veronica Ruckert. And so for anyone watching this, you probably have noticed that I'm very soft-spoken, and to some, I don't really project from my diaphragm like I should. It's a little more breathy. People have asked if I'm sick when I'm not sick. So a book all about voice, and particularly female voices, definitely seems like it's going to be up my alley, right? But this book spoke to me in more ways than I could even begin to describe. One of those creepy instances where you feel like a book might be written for you. And so in that way, I'm not sure if everyone watching this will be as interested in Outspoken, but she talks a lot about how women more than men, like girls, more often than men, are reprimanded when they're growing up for having a tone of voice or talking too loud. Boys, when they grow up, are not reprimanded as much or in the same way as girls for raising their voice. It's not perceived as badly when young boys maybe talk back or speak up in their household, whereas girls more often than not are taught not to do so and are called out if their tone of voice isn't in a perfectly acceptable range. It also talks about adult women who work in an open IT environment. And before quarantine and lockdown, I worked in an open quarantine environment. Not a quarantine environment. We were quarantined on the 5th floor. No, in an open IT environment, and how that actually makes us even quieter, because while those environments are designed to invite collaboration, the whole entire time you're worried you're going to be too loud for the people around you. So you learn to basically speak quietly in these environments because you don't want to be too loud for the people around you. So that hit close to home. So many parts of this book hit close to home that I actually wanted to personally reach out to the author. Haven't done so yet because there is a lot that's tied up around the voice, and I've even thought for myself, like, I should go to a voice coach. I should go somewhere. But when I actually looked into that, there really are only voice coaches for like severe speech impediments, like a medical need. So you're talking like $800 an hour. It's not cheap to get that sort of speech assistance. So I think this is a topic that I'm hoping gets more talked about because it can definitely impact people's lives. I've been told that I don't come across as confident because I'm soft-spoken, and it's unfortunate because, I feel like I'm almost too confident sometimes. But the voice has to match your intentions. The voice has to convey what you wanted to convey. And so I thought this book was very powerful and definitely a good read for anyone, especially women. If you feel like somewhere in your life your voice hasn't been respected or hasn't been accepted or has maybe held you back at some point. So definitely a powerful read. So there you have it, my 20 best books of 2020. And I hope there was a book in there that piques your interest. I had many other 5-star books this year. Like I said, I'm almost at 160 books, but I tried to narrow it down to the best that I wanted to recommend. But I will include a list below as well of the 5-star books that I didn't include in this list, but still books that I gave 5 stars this year that I really enjoyed. So thank you for watching, and hope you guys have a great rest of your 2020.